There is something peculiar about our times that strikes me whenever I witness the fevered enthusiasm with which young minds embrace what they call woke consciousness. Having spent decades observing the tides of intellectual fashion, from the May 1968 revolts to the campus upheavals of more recent years, I recognize in this movement something far more troubling than mere political disagreement. What we face is not simply another iteration of left-wing activism, but a systematic assault on the very foundations of meaning itself. The woke ideology, with its relentless deconstruction of tradition, its obsession with grievance, and its demand for ideological purity, represents perhaps the most sophisticated form of nihilism our civilization has yet produced. It presents itself as enlightenment while practicing the darkest arts of cultural destruction. Having witnessed the intellectual devastation wrought by postmodern theory in our universities, I find myself compelled to examine how this new manifestation operates, why it proves so seductive to the contemporary mind, and what we must understand to preserve the sources of genuine meaning against its corrosive influence. Chapter 1: The Language of Destruction. One of the most insidious aspects of woke culture lies in its systematic corruption of language itself. Words, those sacred vessels through which human beings have transmitted wisdom across generations, become weapons in the hands of ideological zealots. During my years at Cambridge and beyond, I have watched with growing alarm as concepts like justice, equality, and compassion are stripped of their traditional meanings and weaponized for political purposes. Consider how the word racism has evolved. Once referring to the demonstrable belief in racial superiority and the systematic oppression based on such beliefs, it now encompasses virtually any acknowledgement of cultural differences or defense of established institutions. When everything becomes racist, from mathematical competence to punctuality, from merit-based evaluation to the very notion of objective truth, we witness what Orwell prophetically described as the destruction of language as a tool of thought. Similarly, diversity once meant the beautiful variety of human experience and perspective that emerges naturally from different traditions, temperaments, and talents. Now it means numerical representation according to predetermined categories, enforced through institutional mandates that reduce human beings to their superficial characteristics. The rich diversity of thought, character, and genuine difference is sacrificed on the altar of statistical equality. The manipulation of language serves a deeper purpose than mere political advantage. It destroys our ability to think clearly about fundamental questions of human existence. When words lose their stable meanings, anchored in centuries of philosophical reflection and lived experience, we lose our capacity for rational discourse. We become trapped in a world where truth itself becomes suspect, where every claim to knowledge is reduced to an expression of power relations. This linguistic confusion creates what I call semantic nihilism, a condition where words become so malleable that they cease to refer to anything real beyond the speaker's ideological commitments. In such an environment, meaningful conversation becomes impossible, and we are left with nothing but competing assertions of will disguised as moral argument. The consequences extend far beyond academic debate. When language is corrupted, our capacity for moral reasoning deteriorates. We lose the ability to make necessary distinctions between justice and revenge, between equality and uniformity, between compassion and sentimentality. The result is not greater precision in moral thinking but the collapse of moral thinking altogether. Chapter 2: The Cult of Victimhood. At the heart of woke ideology lies an obsession with victimhood that fundamentally distorts our understanding of human dignity and moral responsibility. This is not the legitimate concern for genuine suffering that has always characterized civilized society, but rather the elevation of victimhood status to the highest form of moral authority. Having observed this phenomenon develop over decades in academic and cultural institutions, I find myself confronting a complete inversion of traditional moral understanding. I have witnessed how this victim cult operates in universities, where students compete to establish their credentials as oppressed minorities. The hierarchy of victimhood becomes a new aristocracy, where moral authority derives not from wisdom, virtue, or achievement, but from one's position on an ever-shifting scale of grievance. This creates a perverse incentive structure where individuals are rewarded for discovering new ways in which they have been wronged, real or imagined. This phenomenon destroys several fundamental aspects of human flourishing. First, it undermines personal agency by teaching people to see themselves primarily as acted upon rather than as actors in their own lives. When every difficulty becomes evidence of systemic oppression, when every failure is attributed to invisible forces of discrimination, we lose our capacity for self-improvement and moral growth. The ancient wisdom that sees struggle and suffering as opportunities for character development is replaced by a therapeutic culture that treats all difficulty as trauma requiring external intervention. Second, it corrupts our understanding of justice itself. True justice, as understood from Aristotle through Aquinas to modern jurisprudence, seeks to restore right relationships and repair genuine harms through proportionate responses. Victim ideology, by contrast, seeks endless reparation for historical and often imaginary wrongs. It transforms justice from a healing force that enables communities to move forward into an instrument of revenge that perpetuates conflict across generations. Most destructively, the cult of victimhood eliminates forgiveness from human relationships. In traditional understanding, both Christian and secular, forgiveness was the mechanism by which societies moved beyond past wrongs toward reconciliation and renewal. The woke ideology rejects forgiveness as a form of complicity with oppression, leaving us trapped in cycles of resentment that can never be resolved. This creates what I call resentment culture, a society organized around the perpetual maintenance of grievance rather than the pursuit of common good. Such a culture cannot build or preserve anything of lasting value because it is constitutionally incapable of gratitude for what has been received or hope for what might be achieved. Chapter 3: The Assault on Beauty and Excellence. Nothing reveals the nihilistic character of woke culture more clearly than its systematic assault on beauty and excellence. Having devoted much of my intellectual life to defending the objective reality of beauty, from my early work on aesthetics through my later explorations of music and architecture, I find myself witnessing its deliberate destruction in the name of inclusivity and equity. In our universities, the very concept of aesthetic judgment is now considered suspect. Students are taught that claims about beauty are merely expressions of cultural privilege, that Shakespeare is no greater than any contemporary writer chosen for ideological reasons, that Western classical music represents nothing more than the assertion of white supremacy. The accumulated wisdom of centuries of artistic achievement is dismissed as the artifact of oppressive power structures rather than the result of human creative genius responding to universal aspects of our nature. This represents a profound category error that reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what beauty actually is. Beauty, properly understood, is not the property of any particular culture or group, but rather a universal human capacity for recognizing order, harmony, and transcendence in our encounter with reality. When we experience genuine beauty, whether in a Bach fugue, a Gothic cathedral, or a perfectly crafted poem, we are not asserting cultural dominance but responding to objective features of reality that speak to our deepest nature as rational beings capable of perceiving meaning and value. The attack on excellence follows a similar pattern of ideological corruption. Merit-based evaluation is condemned as perpetuating inequality, and standards are systematically lowered in the name of inclusion. But excellence is not the enemy of equality, it is the condition for human flourishing. When we abandon the pursuit of excellence, we deprive both individuals and society of the goods that make life worth living: great art, scientific discovery, moral wisdom, and the deep satisfaction that comes from developing our capacities to their fullest extent. I have observed how this plays out in education, where the demand for equal outcomes leads to the elimination of challenging curricula and demanding standards. students are robbed of the opportunity to develop their capacities, to struggle with difficult material, to experience the joy of genuine achievement earned through effort and perseverance. The result is not equality but the universal impoverishment of human potential. The assault on beauty extends to our physical environment as well. Traditional architecture, with its emphasis on proportion, ornament, and connection to place, is dismissed as elitist. We are left with the brutal functionalism of modernist design that treats human beings as units to be processed rather than souls to be uplifted. The result is an environment that systematically uglifies our daily experience and cuts us off from the sources of visual and spatial pleasure that nourish the human spirit. Chapter 4: The Destruction of Tradition and Memory. Perhaps no aspect of woke ideology proves more destructive than its systematic assault on tradition and historical memory. Having witnessed both the preservation and destruction of cultural inheritance during my time in communist Eastern Europe, I understand intimately how the severing of connections to the past leaves individuals and societies vulnerable to ideological manipulation. The woke approach to history is fundamentally ahistorical, which is to say, it refuses to understand the past on its own terms. Instead of seeking to comprehend how previous generations understood their world and why they acted as they did, it judges past figures and institutions by contemporary standards, finding them invariably wanting. Every historical achievement is tainted by association with practices we now reject. Every great figure is diminished by moral failures we would not tolerate today. The result is not a more accurate understanding of the past but the complete destruction of any sense of inherited wisdom or cultural continuity. This historical vandalism serves a clear ideological purpose. By severing our connection to the past, woke culture leaves individuals rootless and dependent on contemporary ideological authorities for guidance. When nothing from the past can be trusted, when all inherited wisdom is suspect, when every tradition is revealed as oppressive, people become vulnerable to whatever doctrine promises to fill the resulting spiritual and intellectual void. I have observed this phenomenon in the iconoclastic fury that swept through our cities, where statues were torn down not based on careful historical evaluation but as ritualistic expressions of ideological purity. These acts of destruction were not reforms based on reasoned argument but revolutionary gestures designed to break the chain of cultural transmission that connects us to our ancestors and their achievements. The loss of historical memory creates what I call cultural amnesia, a condition where societies lose their capacity to learn from past experience. Without understanding how we arrived at our current institutions and values, we cannot adequately defend them against assault or reform them intelligently when change becomes necessary. We become like patients suffering from memory loss, unable to learn from experience or maintain coherent identity over time. More profoundly, the destruction of tradition eliminates one of the primary sources of meaning in human life. Tradition provides us with larger narratives of purpose that extend beyond our individual existence, connects us to communities that transcend the boundaries of our immediate experience, and offers tested wisdom for navigating life's perennial challenges. When these connections are severed, we are left with nothing but the thin gruel of contemporary ideology to sustain us. The attack on tradition also destroys the possibility of genuine education, which has always involved the transmission of accumulated wisdom from one generation to the next. Instead of learning from the mistakes and achievements of our predecessors, students are taught to see the past only as a source of guilt and resentment. They graduate not as heirs to a great civilization but as strangers in their own cultural homeland. Chapter 5: The False Promise of Liberation. Woke ideology presents itself as a liberation movement, promising to free humanity from various forms of oppression and constraint. Yet having studied the nature of genuine freedom throughout my career, from my early work on Kant's moral philosophy to my later explorations of political liberty, I recognize in this promise something far more sinister, a totalitarian impulse disguised as emancipation. True freedom, as philosophers from Aristotle to Mill have recognized, requires both external conditions and internal capacities. It demands not just the absence of external constraints but the development of rational faculties, moral character, and cultural resources necessary for meaningful choice. Freedom is not merely the ability to do whatever one wants, but the capacity to choose well among genuine alternatives based on sound judgment and moral understanding. The woke conception of freedom, by contrast, reduces liberation to the elimination of all limitations, boundaries, and standards. Every form of constraint, whether moral, cultural, or natural, is seen as oppressive. Every distinction becomes discriminatory, every standard becomes exclusionary, every norm becomes a tool of domination. This leads to what Isaiah Berlin called negative freedom, freedom defined purely as the absence of constraint rather than the capacity for authentic choice and meaningful action. I have witnessed this false liberation in universities where speech codes proliferate in the name of creating safe spaces. The result is not safety but intellectual suffocation, where genuine inquiry becomes impossible and conformity is enforced through fear rather than conviction. Students are not liberated but imprisoned within narrow ideological boundaries that eliminate the possibility of genuine education through encounter with challenging ideas and uncomfortable truths. The promise of liberation through the elimination of difference proves particularly destructive to human flourishing. Human beings develop their capacities and discover their identities through engaging with otherness, different ideas, different cultures, different ways of life, different moral challenges. When difference is eliminated in the name of equality, when all distinctions are flattened in pursuit of uniformity, we lose the very experiences that promote growth, understanding, and genuine self-knowledge. Most perniciously, woke liberation demands the surrender of individual judgment to collective ideology. Personal responsibility is eliminated in favor of group identity, private conscience is subordinated to public orthodoxy, and genuine moral agency is replaced by ideological compliance. The individual becomes nothing more than a representative of various demographic categories, valued not for unique talents or character but for membership in approved victim groups. This represents a fundamental betrayal of the liberal tradition that actually created the conditions for human freedom and dignity. Instead of protecting the space for individual conscience and rational deliberation, woke ideology demands total submission to its vision of social justice. The result is not liberation but a new form of tyranny that is all the more dangerous because it presents itself as moral enlightenment. Chapter 6: The Institutional Capture. One of the most alarming aspects of woke culture is its systematic capture of institutions that were once devoted to the pursuit of truth and human flourishing. Having spent my career in universities and witnessed their transformation from centers of learning into engines of ideological indoctrination, I can testify to both the methods and consequences of this institutional revolution. The process follows a predictable pattern that I have observed repeatedly across different types of organizations. Initially, woke activists present themselves as advocates for justice and inclusion, goals that any decent person would support. They identify genuine problems, instances of discrimination, lack of representation, or historical injustices, and propose solutions that seem reasonable and moderate. However, these reasonable demands serve as entry points for more radical transformations that only become apparent once the activists have gained institutional power. Once established within an institution, woke activists work systematically to capture key administrative positions, hiring committees, and policy-making bodies. They implement policies ostensibly designed to promote diversity and inclusion but actually designed to enforce ideological conformity and eliminate dissent. The process is gradual and often bureaucratic, making resistance difficult and drawing attention away from the fundamental changes taking place. I have observed how this operates in practice within academic institutions. Faculty members who question prevailing orthodoxies find themselves subjected to investigation for creating hostile environments. Their courses are monitored for signs of ideological deviation. Their research is scrutinized for failure to acknowledge systemic oppression, and their promotion prospects are damaged by failure to demonstrate sufficient commitment to diversity initiatives. The result is not violent suppression but the quiet elimination of intellectual diversity through professional pressure and bureaucratic manipulation. The corruption of educational institutions proves particularly destructive because it affects the formation of future generations. Students are not taught to think critically about complex questions but to reproduce approved conclusions about racism, sexism, and other forms of alleged oppression. They graduate not as educated citizens capable of independent judgment but as ideological activists equipped only to perpetuate the system that formed them. The very possibility of genuine intellectual inquiry is eliminated in favor of political indoctrination. This institutional capture extends far beyond universities to corporations, media organizations, government agencies, and cultural institutions. The result is a coordination of elite opinion that makes dissent increasingly difficult and resistance increasingly costly. When all major institutions speak with one voice on fundamental questions of politics and culture, the space for genuine democratic deliberation disappears. The process is particularly insidious because it operates through the language of liberal values, tolerance, inclusion, diversity, while systematically undermining the conditions that make those values possible. The result is institutions that are simultaneously more ideologically uniform and more politically aggressive, combining the worst features of authoritarianism with the rhetoric of liberation. Chapter 7: The Path to Meaning. Despite the gravity of our situation, I remain convinced that the human hunger for meaning cannot be permanently suppressed by ideological manipulation. Having witnessed the collapse of totalitarian systems in Eastern Europe and observed the resilience of the human spirit under the most adverse conditions, I know that truth has a power that outlasts even the most sophisticated forms of propaganda and cultural control. The recovery of meaning requires, first and foremost, the courage to speak truthfully about our condition. We must name the nihilistic character of woke ideology, expose its contradictions, and demonstrate its destructive effects on human flourishing. This requires intellectual honesty and moral courage from those who understand what is at stake, the very possibility of civilization itself. We must be willing to face social ostracism, professional consequences, and personal attack in defense of truth and beauty. Second, we must actively cultivate the sources of genuine meaning in our own lives and communities. This means engaging seriously with great literature, music, and art, not as museum pieces or historical curiosities, but as living sources of wisdom and beauty that can transform our understanding and enlarge our sympathies. It means participating in religious or philosophical traditions that connect us to transcendent purposes and ultimate questions about the nature of reality and our place within it. Third, we must defend and strengthen institutions that preserve and transmit cultural wisdom. This includes not only educational institutions but families, religious communities, civic organizations, and cultural institutions that maintain connection to our heritage while remaining open to legitimate reform and development. We must work to create alternative institutions when existing ones become too corrupted to fulfill their proper functions. The defense of meaning also requires us to model alternative ways of living that demonstrate the attractiveness of traditional values and practices. When young people see others flourishing through engagement with beauty, truth, and goodness, when they witness lives lived with dignity, purpose, and joy based on timeless principles rather than contemporary fashions, they become curious about these possibilities for themselves. The power of example often proves more persuasive than the force of argument in attracting hearts and minds. Most importantly, we must remember that meaning emerges from love of truth that drives us to seek understanding despite difficulty and opposition, love of beauty that enables us to recognize and create works that uplift the human spirit, Love of particular people and places that gives us concrete reasons for hope and effort. Love of traditions that have nurtured human flourishing across generations and cultures. Against the culture of resentment that characterizes woke ideology, we must practice gratitude for what we have received from previous generations. Against the politics of destruction, we must choose creation and preservation. Against the nihilism that sees only oppression and injustice in human history, we must maintain hope based on the real achievements of civilization and the continuing possibility of human excellence. Conclusion. The struggle against woke culture is ultimately a struggle for the soul of civilization itself. What we face is not merely another political movement that will eventually pass away, but a comprehensive assault on the foundations of meaningful human existence. The stakes could not be higher: the preservation of everything that makes life worth living, from beauty and truth to love and transcendence. Yet I remain fundamentally hopeful, for meaning is not something that can be permanently destroyed by ideological warfare or cultural manipulation. It emerges wherever human beings gather in pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness, wherever they form communities based on love rather than resentment, wherever they choose creation over destruction and gratitude over grievance. Our task is not to return to some imagined golden age but to recover the perennial sources of human flourishing while adapting them intelligently to contemporary conditions. This requires wisdom to distinguish what should be preserved from what should be reformed, courage to defend truth against fashionable falsehoods, and love sufficient to persevere through the difficult work of cultural renewal. The young people caught up in woke ideology are not our enemies but our children, confused by sophisticated forms of nihilism disguised as moral enlightenment. Our response must combine intellectual rigor with pastoral care, firm opposition to destructive ideas with compassionate concern for those who embrace them. We must show them better ways of living and thinking through our own example.